Right now, there are Australians sitting in homes they cannot afford, in suburbs they overpaid for, staring at mortgage statements that are about to get worse. They were told property only goes up. They were shown the auction clearance rates, the smiling agents, the headlines about record prices. But underneath the surface, in 9 specific markets across this country, the foundation is cracking. Not slowly, quietly. And quiet cracks are the ones that swallow equity whole. If you own property in any of these places, or you are thinking about buying, what you do in the next 12 months could determine whether you build wealth or watch it evaporate. This is not a market update. This is a warning. Let me be direct. Nobody knows exactly what property prices will do by 2028. When we talk about a potential 50% collapse, we are talking about extreme scenarios in specific markets and locations, not a guaranteed national outcome. But what is guaranteed is that the cracks are already showing, and the people who get destroyed in downturns are always the ones who ignored the warning signs because they believed property was different this time. For years, Australia's property market has been powered by population growth, limited supply, investor demand, and rising household wealth. Prices pushed toward levels that once seemed impossible. But markets do not move in straight lines forever. Interest rates matter, employment matters, migration matters, credit conditions matter, and expectations matter most of all. The moment enough people stop believing prices can only rise, psychology shifts. That is when markets become dangerous. That is where this story begins. Number 9. Darwin. Darwin gets ignored because it is small. That is the trap. Small markets do not just move, they swing. When money floods in, prices surge. When demand dries up, they collapse. We have seen this before. Darwin has experienced violent property swings tied to mining cycles, energy projects, and population flows. What most people miss is that smaller markets have almost no protection when conditions change. A few major employers pull back. A resource project stalls, and suddenly buyers vanish. Your equity does not just dip, it can vanish. Darwin has seen price drops of 30% or more in past cycles. That is not a correction. That is a wealth destruction event. Affordability looks like safety. It is not. Affordability without economic momentum is just a cheaper way to lose money, and that pattern repeats across this entire list. But if you think small markets are the only danger, the next city proves that stability itself can be a lie. Number 8. Canberra, the safe city, strong public sector, high incomes, stable growth. That is the headline. Here is the reality. Canberra's prices became extremely stretched relative to incomes during the pandemic boom. When borrowing costs rise and affordability gets crushed, even stable cities can enter long periods of stagnation. The danger is not a sudden crash. It is paying peak prices for an asset that goes nowhere for years while inflation silently devours your purchasing power. Imagine buying a property expecting growth and watching your equity flatline as your debt stays heavy. You are paying 6% interest on an asset returning 2% growth. Every month your cash flow burns. Every quarter your real wealth shrinks. That is the silent killer. And for households carrying enormous mortgages, stagnation is just a slow-motion crash. Canberra is only warming us up, because the next city shows what happens when speculation replaces sanity. Number 7. Hobart. A few years ago, Hobart was the darling of Australian property. Investors could not get enough. Prices surged. Competition exploded. Everyone wanted Tasmania. Then reality crept back in. The problem with boom markets is simple. People stop asking what a property is worth. They start asking what somebody else might pay next year. That shift is everything. Speculation becomes the fuel. And when speculation fades, prices struggle. Hobart already cooled dramatically compared with its boom years. Investors who bought at the peak are already underwater on paper. Some cannot sell because there is nobody to sell to at their price. they are trapped. When a market becomes dependent on excitement rather than fundamentals, the downside risk explodes. Do you see the pattern yet? Markets that rise rapidly become vulnerable because people start believing the rise itself is proof of future growth. That belief is dangerous. Adelaide is next, and this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Number 6, Adelaide. Before you jump in the comments, hear this. Adelaide has been one of Australia's strongest performers. Prices have climbed dramatically. Demand is strong, supply is tight. On the surface, everything looks fantastic. That is exactly why it is here. The biggest risk always appears after enormous gains. When prices surge far faster than incomes, affordability eventually breaks. First home buyers get squeezed out. Investor yields collapse. Rents might rise, but they do not rise fast enough to justify the price someone just paid. The numbers tell a different story than the headlines. Strong growth does not mean low risk. It often means the opposite. The further a market runs ahead of fundamentals, the more vulnerable it becomes if conditions change. And conditions are changing. Borrowing power is under pressure. Living costs remain high. Many households are carrying enormous debt loads. That does not guarantee a crash, but it increases fragility, and fragile markets can break without warning. Number 5, Brisbane. This is where things get uncomfortable. Brisbane has become one of Australia's favourite property stories. Interstate migration, Olympic excitement, strong population growth, infrastructure spending, investors chasing returns. The narrative sounds almost perfect. But narratives are dangerous. The most expensive mistakes in history always occur when everyone agrees on the same story. Think about that. When a market becomes universally loved, expectations become enormous, and enormous expectations create enormous risk. Recent years have seen Brisbane values surge at a pace that shocked even optimistic analysts. The city benefited from migration flows, affordability advantages relative to Sydney, and strong demand. But affordability advantages do not last forever. Once prices rise enough, the advantage shrinks. And when that happens, buyers become more selective. Here is the real issue. Many investors are now entering markets after the biggest gains have already occurred. They are chasing yesterday's performance. That is one of the oldest traps in investing. Buying because something already went up, not because future risk and reward remain attractive. And if economic conditions weaken, highly popular markets can disappoint very quickly. But what happens next is worse. Because the next city has a history of boom and bust cycles that should make every buyer nervous. Number 4, Perth. Perth is fascinating. It is one of the strongest property success stories in recent years. Prices surged, demand exploded, listings remained tight. Some forecasts became incredibly optimistic, but history matters, and Perth's history is filled with dramatic cycles. When resource booms accelerate, Perth can feel unstoppable. Money flows, jobs grow, confidence rises, property values climb. Then the cycle changes. We have seen it before. And when it changes, sentiment can reverse with shocking speed. This is not random. This is the pattern. Resource-linked markets often experience larger swings because they are influenced by forces beyond local housing demand. Commodity prices, mining investment, global growth, employment conditions, corporate spending. The entire chain matters. What most people miss is this. A market can look incredibly strong right before momentum fades. The strongest gains often attract the most attention, and that attention attracts late buyers. Late buyers are usually the most vulnerable buyers. They arrive after most of the easy money has already been made, and if conditions change, they are often left holding the risk. Stay with me, because we are now entering the cities that dominate Australia's property conversation. Number 3, Melbourne. This city is one of the most fascinating property stories in the country. Melbourne has already experienced periods of weakness compared with other capitals. While some cities raced ahead, Melbourne often lagged. Some buyers see that as opportunity, others see danger. The truth is more complicated. Melbourne faces enormous strengths, a massive economy, strong population growth, world-class infrastructure, education, culture, employment. But it also faces serious affordability challenges. The bigger issue is debt. Australian households collectively carry enormous mortgage burdens, and expensive cities are particularly sensitive to borrowing conditions. A small change in borrowing power can have a surprisingly large impact on prices. Think about someone approved for $1 million loan. Reduce borrowing capacity by 10% and suddenly their purchasing power drops dramatically. Multiply that across thousands of buyers. Now prices face pressure. This changes everything, because property is not only about demand, it is about finance demand, the ability to borrow, the ability to service debt, the willingness to take risk. And when those factors weaken simultaneously, even major cities can struggle. But Melbourne is not the city that concerns people most. That honour belongs elsewhere. Number 2, Sydney, the giant. The market everybody watches, the market that dominates headlines, the market that has created extraordinary wealth, and the market that may carry extraordinary expectations. Sydney remains one of the most expensive housing markets on earth. For many households, ownership feels increasingly out of reach. That reality matters, because affordability eventually becomes a limiting factor. You can only stretch household finances so far before demand begins to crack. Recent forecasts from major institutions have already discussed the possibility of declines in Sydney under certain economic conditions. Some analysts have warned about corrections if borrowing costs remain elevated and investor activity slows. Others remain bullish. That is what makes this so important. The future is not obvious, but the risk is real. And here is the dangerous assumption. Many people believe Sydney can never experience meaningful declines because it always recovers, eventually. Maybe that is true over very long periods. But if you buy near a peak and values fall significantly, the recovery may take years. Years matter. Especially if you are over-leveraged, especially if your job situation changes, especially if life throws unexpected costs your way. That is where property becomes dangerous. Not when everything goes right, when something goes wrong. And now we arrive at the city almost nobody expects to see at number 1. Number 1, the Gold Coast. Not because it is Australia's biggest city, not because it is Australia's most expensive city, but because it combines several risk factors that often appear near the top of boom cycles: lifestyle demand, investor demand, speculative demand, migration-driven demand, rapid price growth, emotional buying. The Gold Coast has benefited enormously from changing work patterns, interstate migration, and lifestyle-driven purchasing. For years, buyers poured in, prices climbed, confidence exploded. But lifestyle markets can be surprisingly volatile. Why? Because emotional demand can disappear faster than necessity demand. A person buying because they need housing behaves differently from a person buying because they are chasing a dream. When economic uncertainty rises, dreams often get postponed. That does not mean the Gold Coast is doomed. Far from it. It means expectations matter. And markets built on extremely optimistic expectations can become vulnerable when sentiment shifts. Now the bigger picture becomes obvious. Every city on this list shares at least one common characteristic: high expectations, rapid growth, affordability pressure, economic sensitivity, or dependence on a particular narrative. And narratives are powerful until reality changes them. But here is the twist most people completely miss. The real danger may not be these cities. The real danger may be specific pockets within them. certain suburbs, certain apartment markets, certain investor-heavy developments, certain locations where supply suddenly surges, because property crashes rarely happen evenly. Some areas hold up surprisingly well, others get smashed. That is why broad headlines can be misleading. You hear that a city rose 5%, but one suburb fell 15%. You hear that a market stayed stable, but a particular segment collapsed. The details matter, and people lose money because they ignore the details. Now let us talk about something most doom and gloom videos never discuss. What should smart buyers actually do? This is the part nobody talks about. The safest opportunities often look boring. They do not create viral headlines. They do not make people feel like geniuses. They simply reduce risk. Strong employment hubs, diverse local economies, limited oversupply, good infrastructure, reasonable affordability relative to incomes, sustainable rental demand. These factors are not exciting, but they matter a lot. The biggest mistake many buyers make is confusing popularity with safety. Those are not the same thing. A suburb can be incredibly popular and incredibly risky at the same time. If expectations become detached from reality, popularity can actually increase danger. The smarter question is not whether a market is hot. The smarter question is whether the fundamentals justify the price. That single question can save people hundreds of thousands of dollars. And here is another warning. Do not become obsessed with predictions, including this video. The goal is not to perfectly predict 2028. The goal is to understand risk. Anyone claiming they know exactly what property prices will do is selling certainty that simply does not exist. Markets are complex. Economic conditions change. Government policies change. Interest rates change. Migration changes. Global events change. That is reality. The people who survive property downturns are not usually the people with the best predictions. They are the people with the strongest risk management. They leave room for mistakes. They avoid stretching finances to breaking point. They think about downside before upside. And they understand that protecting wealth is often more important than chasing maximum returns. That mindset becomes priceless when markets become volatile. So let us bring this all together. Could 9 Australian cities crash by 50% in value by 2028? It is possible in extreme scenarios for specific markets and locations, but it is far from a certainty, and many analysts expect much smaller moves than that. The real lesson is not the exact number. The real lesson is the risk hiding beneath today's confidence. When people believe prices only rise, danger grows. When buyers stop asking hard questions, danger grows. When expectations become inflated, danger grows. And that is exactly why this conversation matters. Because financial disasters rarely arrive with flashing warning lights. They arrive disguised as confidence. They arrive disguised as certainty. They arrive disguised as the belief that this time is different. Do not ignore the signals. Do not blindly follow the crowd. And do not mistake a rising market for a safe market. If this video made you rethink the property market, tell me in the comments which Australian city you think carries the biggest risk over the next few years and why. And if you want more deep dives exposing the hidden risks, surprising opportunities, and behind-the-scenes forces shaping Australia's property market, make sure you subscribe. Because the next shift may already be underway, and by the time most people notice it, it could be far too late.